The Drum, the Doll, and the Zombie by Brad Strickland and John Bellairs. Chapter 2. As it turned out, the explosion that Johnny heard was an electrical transformer. A big maple tree in Mrs. Kovac's yard fell against an electrical pole down the street from the professor's house, and the impact shorted out the transformer on the pole. When it blew, it knocked out the power to that part of Dustin Heights. Of course, Johnny did not learn this immediately. For a few minutes, he and the others kept busy stamping and slapping out the burning red embers that the wind had blown into the room. Fergie, did you see what... Fergie, do you see what you did? Snapped Johnny, really irritated with his friend. In the ruddy glow of the fire, Fergie's face showed astonishment. Me? Dixon, I'm innocent. The storm and the wind did this, not some creepy-crawly drumbeat. Unlike Johnny, Fergie was not very superstitious, and he always insisted that practically everything had a scientific explanation. At last, when they had put out all the sparks, Professor Childermass lit some candles and a kerosene lamp. The telephone was dead, so he insisted on shepherding Johnny and Fergie across the street, where Johnny's grandparents were relieved to see them. In fact, Grandpa Dixon was just getting into his slicker to come and check on the boys. Grandpa was a gangly, slightly stooped old man with a wrinkled face and a freckled bald head, with just a few strands of hair draped over it. He carried a lighted kerosene lamp, which he set down on the kitchen table as he said, "Thanks for the delivery service, Rod." "Think nothing of it, Henry," Professor Childermass said. "I wouldn't dream of sending them out alone in this storm." "It is bad, ain't it?" muttered Grandma Dixon, a somewhat frail woman who wore her white hair in a neat bun. She ran a hand through Johnny's hair. "Mercy, you're soaked through. You and Fergie just hurry and change into your pajamas before you catch your deaths. I declare I've never seen it storm this bad in my whole life." "I don't know about that," replied Grandpa. "How about the hurricane last year? And what about..." Johnny and Fergie went to change as the older folks started reminiscing about hurricanes, hailstorms, and really bad downpours. The storm began to let up, and both Johnny and Fergie went to sleep around midnight. The power company restored the electricity the next morning, and Johnny and Fergie saw Dr. Coote drive away in his old blue Chevrolet. "Wonder if he took the crazy bongo with him," Fergie said. "I don't know," answered Johnny, "but I hope nothing bad happens because of what you did last night." Fergie snickered. "Man, oh man, you should have seen your face when the prof brought in the candles. You were white as a tombstone, and your eyes were as round as marbles." "John, baby, I didn't know my voice was that bad." Johnny mumbled that there were some things that it was better not to fool around with, but Fergie was no longer paying attention. In the bright light of a cool September Sunday, Johnny had to admit that his fears seemed pretty groundless. Of course, it was one thing to laugh at spooky tales as you got ready for church in the cheerful morning daylight, and another to hear them in the dark night with a terrible storm raging. At least nothing horrible had happened. As September ended and October began, Johnny found himself occupied with homework and the World Series and plans for a Halloween party. He soon forgot about the drum and Dr. Coote's odd yarn. All of Johnny's new concerns, the most pressing was the Halloween party. 2 years earlier, Johnny had decided he was too old to go trick-or-treating, so he had remained home and handed out candy to little kids. Still, Johnny had to admit he missed the fun of dressing up in some outlandish costume. That was why he volunteered to help when teachers at St. Michael's School decided to throw a Halloween party to raise money for some badly needed equipment. The older students would dress up in costumes and run the games that the younger kids would enjoy. To Johnny, the party was an ideal opportunity. He could have all the fun of wearing a Halloween costume and none of the embarrassment of having crabby grown-ups peer out at him and mutter, "A little old for trick-or-treating, ain't you, kiddo?" He was trying to decide what kind of costume to wear. He sort of saw himself as a scary vampire with a long black cloak, slicked back hair, and fangs. However, he had two big disadvantages. First, his hair was blonde, and all the vampires he had seen in the movies had black hair. Second, he wore glasses, and something told him that a bespectacled Count Dracula wouldn't even scare a first grader. He practiced going around the house without his glasses, and he could see clearly enough to avoid bumping into the furniture. Unfortunately, he was nearsighted, and that meant he might have a hard time judging the winners in the dart toss contest he and two other students would be running. Johnny could imagine what might happen if some first graders threw a wild dart and he could not see it in time to jump out of the way. His grandmother suggested that he go as a clown, but Johnny wanted a better idea than that. Grandpa Dixon thought he could make him up as a tramp, which was what he always recommended. After all, a tramp costume could be scrounged up from just any old clothes that lay around the house, and it wouldn't cost a cent. It wasn't that Johnny's grandfather was stingy, but he was reluctant to spend scarce money on an outfit that, after all, Johnny could only use one night a year. Johnny and Fergie went to different schools, but when Fergie found out about the Halloween party, he said he wanted to come along, and he intended to come in costume. "Why don't we both go as zombies?" he asked. "You know, the Walking Dead, like Dr. Coote was talking about. Beware the Walking Dead, John baby. I can see it now. We come in wearing moldy clothes like we've been buried for weeks. We'll get some green makeup for our faces and rub dirt in our hair. Best of all, my dad's got a fishing outfit with those artificial rubber worms on it. He won't mind if I swipe a few. They look real, and we can plaster them down on our faces and have them dripping out our noses and ears. What you think of that, Big John? Scary?" "More disgusting than scary," said Johnny, making a face. "I don't know about putting rubber worms up my nose, but maybe the zombie idea could work. At least it would take the same kind of old clothes as Grandpa's tramp costume." "Sure," said Fergie. "And let's read up on zombies to see if we're missing anything that will make the costumes even sharper. I'll bet the prof has a book or two in his library that would help. How about paying him a visit and seeing if he'll loan you a couple of volumes?" "Okay," agreed Johnny. "And if the zombie plan doesn't work, maybe we can find something else just as good." And that was why, one Wednesday night toward the end of October, Johnny went across the street to Professor Childermass's house after supper. The professor had not had a great deal of time to spend with Johnny lately. A flu epidemic had hit Hagstrom College. Professor Childermass had taken over classes for another history teacher, Dr. Duquesne, who was very sick. Teaching a double load kept the professor extremely busy, and it made his temper even worse than normal. Fortunately, he seemed immune to the disease. His students each told each other that flu germs were afraid to attack the crabby old man. Johnny rang the doorbell twice before he heard shuffling footsteps. The door opened, spilling a warm splash of light out into the night. Professor Childermass appeared troubled and subdued. "Oh, it's you, John Michael," he said. "Come on in. I hope you haven't come bearing ill tidings." No, Professor. I'm not bearing any tidings at all." Johnny stepped into the professor's house. "Why, have you had bad news?" Professor Childermass took a deep breath. "Well, yes, I am afraid so. Charlie Coote is in the hospital up in New Hampshire." "Does he have the flu?" Johnny asked. The professor shook his head. His expression was grim. "No, it's something worse than that. He's not exactly in his right mind." They sat at the professor's kitchen table. The kitchen was in its normal messy state, with dirty pots, pans, and dishes stacked in the sink. Though it smelled wonderfully of fresh cake and chocolate, baking was just about the professor's favorite hobby. He served up a slice of yellow cake with chocolate banana icing and poured Johnny a tall glass of milk. Johnny dug in and told the professor how good it was. His friend nodded absently. "What's the matter with Dr. Coote?" asked Johnny. The professor sat at the table and drank a cup of coffee. "It's rather odd. The doctor on the staff at Mercy Hospital called me. He says Charlie did not show up for his classes on Monday, so around noon, someone at the college drove over to his house to check on him. He found poor Charlie ill in bed, babbling nonsense. They bundled him off to the hospital, where he kept mentioning my name and phone number over and over again. Except for that, he has been making no sense at all, they say. He jabbers about dead people and midnight and that confounded drum, but no one can understand what he is trying to say." "But what's wrong with him? Don't the doctors know?" asked Johnny. Dr. Coote was not one of his closest friends, but he liked the old man, and the news of his illness upset Johnny. "The doctors don't know, as a matter of fact," muttered the professor. "Bunch of quacks. It sounds as if my old friend is showing all the mental symptoms of a stroke, but the doctor told me there's no sign of paralysis or any other physical symptoms of stroke. They are calling it a nervous breakdown for the time being. I don't know. Poor Charlie has always been high-strung, and I guess it's possible that he worried himself into a crack-up over that idiotic toy drum." "What are you going to do, Professor?" Professor Childermass drank the last of his coffee. "I hardly know," he admitted. "I honestly don't see anything much that I can do, but Charlie is an old and dear friend, and I do not have many of them left. I hate to think of him all alone in that hospital. His wife has been dead for years, you know, and they had no children. His only close relative is his sister, and she lives in California, or some such barbaric state. So I am the only one who can rally round in an emergency. I would go up tonight, but the doctor told me that although Charlie is just about helpless, he is in no immediate danger. I'll drive to see him this Friday after class and stay until Sunday. If nothing else, at least I can show Charlie that I am thinking of him, and possibly he will be a bit more lucid with me around then than he has been with all those strangers. Johnny felt embarrassed. All at once, his problem of what to wear to a stupid Halloween party seemed unimportant. He said, Professor, may I go with you? I like Dr. Coote too, and I like to keep you company. If you don't mind my tagging along. Professor Childermass smiled. He liked very few people the way he liked Johnny Dixon. Johnny was brainy, resourceful, and kind-hearted, just as he himself had been at that age, and Johnny had a way of making sensible conversation and asking the right questions at the right time, which were gifts that the professor always admired. He said, If you really want to go, John Michael, I shall be happy to have you along. Fortunately, that blasted fool Duquesne has recovered from the vapors and brain fever, and will be taking his worthless students off my hands tomorrow. Professor Childermass hesitated. Then he said in a very serious voice, It would be unfair to me to allow you to go along without saying this, John. Be prepared for the worst. Johnny felt his heart thump. What do you mean? The professor shook his head and sighed. I mean that Charlie is a tougher old bird than you would think, but he is an old bird. Well, John, to be honest, he may not make it. For a second, the professor just sat at the table looking bleak. Then he began to cry. Johnny swallowed it all lump in his throat. For the first time, he realized just how sick Dr. Coote must really be. And that is the end of Chapter 2.